first word. Let that be a warning. This is the point where I always tell the joke. So Ed, mind your manners, because we're being recorded. We are actually online. And I think the screen may start to fill with some squares, but when it is time for the presentation, you'll see my daughter. And her face will fill the screen. There are some people that we need to thank. And the truth is, Bob Spencer was here yesterday, and I know they did some consulting even on Friday, but to get gear set up and to experiment with wires and sound and the internet and electricity, just all the things that have to work right. You might be surprised at how many things have to function perfectly in order to do these things. So anyway, but to Bob Spencer, shall we say thank you? The other one that I don't know if you realize this, but Marco is Marco on the screen somewhere? Can people see Marco's face? Yeah, wave, Marco. Some of you realize that, Marco has been through some significant stuff since the last time he was actually on our campus. And there's a reason that I haven't seen him for like a month. He spent, I don't know, I think 3 weeks at Harborview, and 2 of those were in ICU. The guy is amazing.
23 days.
Okay. Not only have we been praying for you, Marco, but we need you for this class. So come on.
I made it in time, just in time for Aaron.
We'll be kind of managing things as co-host and the recording and such. And I think he'll tell you too that the session not only is being recorded here right now, but it will be posted eventually on the church's YouTube channel. How many are subscribers to the church's YouTube channel? I feel like I'm selling or pitching, but that's a way too to kind of stay connected, to see what's posted there, worship services, learning sessions, and all kinds of activities. More folks are finding their way in the room. This is great. If we've got to add chairs, we got plenty. There's a bunch on the screen as well. All that is a happy thing. Let me ask this. How many of you have ever heard Great Replacement? See, a lot of people, that's language that's familiar if you've been reading anything about kind of contemporary events. I won't try to explain what it is. We actually have an expert that can do that. How many have ever heard of affect theory? Okay, some of the educators in the room know a little bit about that, but those are kind of things, tools, ways we can look at human behavior, human interaction, and the way communities function and behave together. That might be some aha for us, given not only biblical text, given not only our theological tradition, but where we find ourselves in a pretty tough contemporary world. I don't have to tell you what it's like on screens. I don't have to tell you what it's like in this context that runs deep in American culture these days. Are there ways that people of faith can move and function? Are there ways that people of faith can be of good conscience and get things done in a world where there is such antipathy, such vitriol, such well, I'm gonna run out of words because bad words start to come out. I think we got to pray. And prayer is not a way to escape. Prayer is not a way to sort of magically hope that things will get better. I think prayer is deep in our core, that to pray is to remember that my life is God's, that I am a possession of that one who longs for peace, who longs for homes, who longs for justice, who longs for a world that is gracious. So the Lord be with you. Let's pray. Oh God, in your goodness, you call us together. You inspire us to things that matter, and you show us the way. And we trust that we would have wise and discerning hearts, that we would commit ourselves again to your purposes. In Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I've known our presenter for 30 years or no, actually a little bit more than that. And well, this is bragging, but she's the smartest person I know. It's just the truth. So I promised I would never call you Professor Parks, but Aaron, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to throw out there, I cannot be the smartest person you know because we both know Stephen. So I'm just going to call a little bit of BS there. But thank you very, very much for that very generous introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Some of you might know I'm in the coursework section of my PhD program at Drew University, where I'm studying theology. And the coursework section of that program is really fun because they encourage us to cast a really wide net and just pursue whatever research interest makes us the most passionate. And recently I've been thinking a lot about conspiracy theory, partly because I think it raises some really interesting questions about what we know and how we know what we know, which is a fancy way of, the fancy word for that is epistemology. And then also I'm interested in how we specifically in our contexts then absorb racialized knowledge. So I am really excited to present some of this information now and then in later sessions in the weeks to come, partly just because it means I get to talk about it with some actual real human beings. So thank you for being part of that. I think just first of all, note of caution, this talk will discuss racial violence and murder, and I'll just also briefly mention sexual assault. So just know that and take care of yourself as necessary. I'm also going to offer us a roadmap of this session and the weeks ahead. But first, I'm going to put up a presentation here on the screen. Let's see. Can everyone see my first slide there?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with a story. 1 year ago, in September 2021, news media in the United States was preoccupied with discussing the growing number of Haitian migrants who were seeking safety at the US border with Mexico. Most of those migrants were turned away, but some were welcomed into the country to pursue their asylum claims in immigration court. And so on September 22nd, popular Fox News personality Tucker Carlson used his show to propose an alternative interpretation of what was happening at the border. In a segment that he called "Nothing About What's Happening is an Accident," Carlson said that current US border policy is designed to, quote, change the racial mix of the country. In political terms, he said, this policy is called the Great Replacement, the replacement of legacy Americans with more obedient people from faraway countries, end quote. Mainstream news sources like the Washington Post and Axios and Rolling Stone were suddenly publishing dozens of articles about Great Replacement. They were ringing alarm bells. They called on experts from the Anti-Defamation League to explain the phenomenon, and the New York Times published an investigation that found Carlson had actually pushed Great Replacement in more than 400 of his shows. And their alarm was not misplaced. 8 months later, on Saturday, May 14, an 18-year-old white man wearing body armor and carrying an AR-15 walked into a grocery store in Buffalo, New York. He shot 13 people, killing 10, all of whom were Black. And not only did he shout racial slurs during the attack, but authorities later discovered that he had written a manifesto. He described himself as a white nationalist, a white supremacist, and a supporter of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theories have consequences. Some of them can be more benign, but others of them can serve as justification for violence, terrorism, and murder. So how do we know when to trust the news that we hear? How do we as a community and as a larger society know when something is true or a lie that's designed to spread hatred? Another question might be, who do we trust to tell us the truth? Now, all 4 sessions for the next 4 weeks will be discussing this specific theory, Great Replacement. And for today, we're just going to start with the basics. I'll cover what Great Replacement is, where it comes from, and then what a conspiracy theory is, and why it's becoming more mainstream in our politics recently. And I'll offer a couple of different lenses to think about this phenomenon, including those of history and psychology and the social sciences. And then, of course, we're going to finish with some opportunity for questions and conversation. In session 2, I'll propose a different kind of a lens. You notice my dad spoiled it a little bit, but it's a tool used sometimes in religious studies, and it's called affect theory, and it has to do with the way that bodies experience emotions. And so I'll use that as a way to explore why conspiracy theory can be so alluring and why it's so often, as in the case of Great Replacement, very deeply racist. And then session 3 will be about the very particular way that Great Replacement is racist and also sexist. We'll analyze how it constructs a sort of fantasy version of white identity, and that it shores up that kind of identity by controlling bodies. So bodies that cross borders, and bodies that can give birth, and bodies that worship in different ways. And then finally, by session 4, I hope we can start to think through what might constitute a faithful response to Great Replacement. So I'll propose a particular reading of the Exodus story, but I hope that we can also look to other biblical and theological resources to construct a public theology of truth and trust and plurality and justice. So for today, to begin to immerse us in some of this content, I have a question for you. And this is just a question for personal reflection for a minute or two. How do you know when a news report is true? Why? And put another way, maybe, what makes you believe it or disbelieve it? So we'll just take a second here. All right, I know that was not enough time to answer the question definitively, but I hope you'll remember it and you'll think about what some of what was coming up for you as we continue along today. So in really general terms, Great Replacement is a conspiracy theory that claims liberal elites are attempting to replace the white citizens of European and North American countries with people of color and immigrants from the 2/3 world. Specifically, these populations are thought to have higher birth rates than white people. And the theory says that this will eventually result in the extinction of the white race and the fall of the so-called Western civilization. Great Replacement has roots both in this country and in Europe, and it actually started in Europe. The phrase Great Replacement first emerged in France right around the year 1900, which was the early days of French nationalism. And the theory claimed that Western identity, or specifically French Western identity, is under attack from immigrants with higher birth rates than Europeans. And the so-called replacement was said to be orchestrated by a group trying to rule the world by creating a racially homogenous society. And this group trying to do the controlling was usually identified as Jews. Rosa Schwartzberg is a journalist and an expert in Great Replacement, and she writes that, quote, "The concept of race and national identity in these works was strongly influenced by France's status as a colonial power and a profiteer of the slave economy. As a colonial power engaged in centuries-long slave trade, the construction of racial difference in France has always been predicated on white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Legacies of fear surrounding slave uprisings and the retributive violence directed toward white masters pervade France's colonial legacy." So the theory was repopularized in the 1970s during a wave of immigration from India to France, and then again in 2010 by Renaud Camus, who's the gentleman with the white beard here in front of us. Camus is the one who inspires most contemporary white supremacists, and he warned of what he called reverse colonization, saying that white native Europeans were being replaced by immigrants from Africa and the Middle East, resulting in, quote, ethnic and civilizational substitution. So he claimed that Muslims were using birth rates strategically, taking advantage of welfare programs and replacing white people. In 2018, he published an abridged version of his book in English, the title of which might be familiar to some of us who have been watching the news for the last few years. He called it "You Will Not Replace Us." It called immigration, quote, an invasion, a migratory tsunami, a submerging wave of ethnic substitution. And so he claimed that technocratic elites from France and Europe were responsible for a plan aimed at replacing Europeans of white ethnicity. And all this was being engineered by a transnational elite that Camus calls Davoscracy, which is an anti-Semitic dog whistle. It's referencing the World Economic Forum that's hosted in Davos, Switzerland. So it plays on those anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish people and money. As you might imagine, these ideas caught on in the United States because we have a tremendous history of racism as well. The just centuries of enslavement of Africans and their descendants, and the subsequent systemic oppression of all people of color, but especially Black people. So in the US, it's called usually white genocide theory, and it originates from the Reconstruction era after the abolition of slavery. So white genocide theorized that the US is on the brink of a race war in which freed slaves would rise up and kill their masters. And it became popular again in the 20th century. In 1985, neo-Nazi David Lane, who's this guy on the screen as well, he blamed Jewish elites for trying to annihilate the white race through interracial marriage and forced assimilation with immigrants. So whereas Great Replacement is primarily Islamophobic because of Europe's colonization of Islamic peoples, white genocide theory is primarily anti-Black and anti-Semitic. But the gap between those two is closing. And the merging of the two represents a growing belief in this notion of an all-encompassing kind of transnational white European identity that's in need of saving. And part of this saving takes the form of an obsession with reproduction and with birth rates and with controlling women. The reproductive capacities of women of color need to be restricted, according to the theory, and the capacities of white women need to be exploited, often by means of rape and sexual assault. The other part of the saving takes the form of attempted genocide of people of color. The call to arms is then heeded all over the world, inspiring a whole host of young white men to commit race-based mass murders, like those in Utoya, Norway, Christchurch, New Zealand, Kansas City, Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, and I think most recently in Buffalo. So there's a lot to unpack there, including the way that this violent racism constructs this sort of fantastical white Western identity, the way that it requires strict racial distinctions, and then polices those distinctions by controlling bodies. And I'm hoping to really dig into all of that in sessions 2 and 3. But for right now, I want to specifically address what makes Great Replacement a conspiracy theory. We have what I hope is a good sense of what's at stake when we are talking about conspiracy theories. They're not just a distrust in mainstream news sources, although that is sometimes part of it. And it's not the same thing as knowledge that most people might consider fringe. In other words, a belief isn't a conspiracy theory just because most people or most forms of authority say that it's not true. There's more to it. Conspiracy theory has the power to inspire its adherents to act, sometimes by not getting vaccinated or by preparing an underground bomb shelter, sometimes by storming the Capitol or by attacking and killing others. So we'll just start with a really basic definition of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy belief is the belief that an organization made up of individuals or groups was or is acting covertly to achieve some malevolent end. A conspiracist worldview implies a universe that is governed by design rather than randomness. So nothing happens by accident, nothing is as it seems, and everything is connected. A conspiracy theory tends to claim that powerful, hidden evil forces control history and human destinies. And this just prompts limitless suspicion and obsession with trying to uncover the magnitude of the evil conspiracy. Usually conspiracy theories are a little bit Manichaean, just meaning that they split the world up into absolute pure good and absolute evil. And so the conspiracy theory is actually reassuring at the same time that it's frightening. It promises a world of order at the same time that it magnifies the power of evil. The enemy is overwhelming, but at least it's definable. Michael Barkin, who is a historian of conspiracy theory, writes that conspiracism explains failure. I might here also use the language of aggrieved entitlement. So a believer might say, I'm supposed to be successful in a way that I have not been. And that lack of success couldn't possibly be because of me. It must be because there's a secret conspiracy of people who are working to undermine me. So in the case of Great Replacement, white men are able to explain away their own inability to attain status in a society by blaming, for example, Jews, feminists, immigrants, people of color, etc. And I also want to note here that sometimes it's tempting to assume that conspiracy theorists are just ignorant. They don't do their research, or they don't fact check, or maybe they've just been given bad information. And sometimes that might be the case. But for most theorists, lack of research is not the problem. Someone who's deeply invested in a conspiracy theory might have spent a lot of time researching, reading, watching, interpreting information in what almost operates as a game, piecing together clues and interpreting disparate data in order to form one coherent narrative. And the problem is that theorists take information and then argue for relationships between data sets in ways that can only confirm the original suspicion that a conspiracy is afoot. So as a conspiracy theory, Great Replacement tends to be attuned to current events, but it reads intention into those events in a way that just confirms the original narrative. So you remember Tucker Carlson saying that nothing happening at the US-Mexico border was an accident. He's connected Biden's immigration policies to the belief that Democrats, especially wealthy Jewish Democrats, are working secretly to bring as many immigrants of color as possible to the United States in order to destroy Western culture, which of course is not true. There are a few different types of conspiracy theories. The first and the most innocuous are event conspiracies, and those relate specifically to events, isolated events in history. So for example, the Kennedy assassination or the moon landing. Systemic conspiracies claim that the conspiracy has broad goals, that a single organization has infiltrated existing institutions. And the last, and probably the most dangerous kind of conspiracy theory, is called a super conspiracy, in which multiple conspiracies are linked together under an all-powerful evil force. Michael Barkin writes that these kinds of conspiracies have grown the fastest in recent years because event and systemic conspiracies have all been tied together in much broader narratives about good and evil. Super conspiracies are also easily entrenched because if the whole world is embroiled in a large cosmic struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, any new piece of information can be integrated into that narrative as like cryptic evidence of the secret war. So super conspiracies might include QAnon or New World Order conspiracies and others, especially those that tend to draw on religious imagery. I'm kind of making the argument, I think Great Replacement can be considered a super conspiracy because it imagines a coming race war and the eventual extinction of the white race and Western civilization. So the whole world and all of its cultures are imagined to be caught up in this apocalyptic struggle for control. Conspiracies have been around for millennia. For example, blood libel is a kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy about Jewish people. The theory says that the Jewish people murder children in order to use their blood for religious rituals. And those kinds of conspiracy theories have been around for as long as Christians have been around, and they were especially popular in the Middle Ages. So it's an old phenomenon. And I think part of that is because conspiracy theories can be tied to certain cognitive biases that we're all vulnerable to. So first, and probably one that you've heard about the most frequently is confirmation bias, which is just the tendency to favor, remember, and recall information that aligns with your pre-existing beliefs. So, for example, a racist person is predisposed to believe conspiracy theories that play on racist themes. Source amnesia leads us to forget where we learned something before we forget the information that we learned. So that's sometimes how disreputable sources can sneak into the mix. The repetition effect means we're more likely to believe something we've heard many, many times. So someone who's integrated in a community of conspiracy theory believers might become more convinced every time they hear more about the theory. A Great Replacement believer, for example, might become more convinced every time he watches Tucker Carlson and hears about immigration or birth rates. Motivated reasoning means that we're motivated to reduce cognitive dissonance in a way that does not threaten ego. So conspiracy theories help explain failure, you remember this, in a way that makes the believer feel less like a failure and more like one of an in-crowd, a special group of people who knows the truth, which I imagine is great for the ego. Novel information bias, which I think is especially operative in conspiracy theories, it leads us to assume that a new piece of information is more likely to be correct simply because it's new to us. So this might lead someone to disregard years of learning about diversity in light of one new and exciting claim about the secret reason for certain immigration policies. The backfire effect, which you may have run into, it occurs when we double down on a belief that we perceive that we're under threat. And this is one reason that aggressively challenging a conspiracy theorist doesn't usually get them to change their mind. And of course, our fear-based amygdala leads us to retain information that indicates we're under threat, and conspiracy theories see danger all around. And especially, for example, danger in demographic change. And then last but certainly not least, we and our brains just long to be part of an in-group, part of a community of believers, especially if that community offers us a way to be special, to be better than, to have privileged access to information that not everybody else has. So for Great Replacement believers, the in-group, it isn't just white people, it's the select few white people who know about the truth, about how Jews, feminists, and technocrats are scheming to destroy civilization. So these have been the findings of those who study conspiracy theory from a psychological perspective. But there are lots of other ways to think about conspiracy theories, and some have investigated that question: why now? Why do they seem to be popping up everywhere now, and they seem to be increasingly normalized? Social scholar Gabriele Constantino argues that crises of political power, democratic institutions, environmental threats, and economic inequality all contribute to the phenomenon of conspiracy theories, whereby, quote, people who have stopped trusting institutions adopt conspiracy theories as epistemic gateways to decipher and expose the inner logics of political power. So, in other words, they allow believers to cling to simple explanations that identify culpable subjects without questioning the core dynamics of power. So, what specifically can we identify as the larger systemic shifts in our society that have promoted the rise of conspiracy theories like Great Replacement? Well, I might argue one of them is that trust in authority right now is pretty low. And here I mean trust in institutions that are responsible for delivering true information to the public, like mainstream news sources. Of course, distrust in the media has been a common talking point in politics for decades. But technological and economic shifts have also eroded that trust in mainstream media. So since media companies have been airing news on a 24-hour news cycle, cable news networks have found it much more lucrative to drive up conflict between partisan commentators than to produce news segments that are researched by journalists. And this creates what Alison Dagnes calls popular political theater rather than news. So the gap between news and opinion has shrunk, and viewers, especially on the right, increasingly turn toward programming like that on Fox News that affirms their own understanding of the world around them, which of course is confirmation bias. And this leads to fragmentation in the process by which our society learns to build knowledge together. Maybe you've heard friends or family say with dismay, like, I just don't know who to trust anymore. I don't know who's telling the truth. And of course, on top of that, sometimes Fox News gives a platform to racist conspiracy theorists like Tucker Carlson. Okay, the second key factor that I'm proposing for you is social media, because social media can curate our access to information. The ability to collect and analyze user data allows advertisers to micro-target groups of people with content that they're most likely to interact with. So this means we're all actually seeing very different information when we log into our social media feeds. And this can isolate susceptible users from spaces of shared knowledge building. And of course, social media platforms, which maximize profit by maximizing attention and engagement, they develop newsfeed algorithms that pull users into increasingly extreme, combative, and emotionally arousing content. And then these side effects can be exploited by state actors like Russia in order to spread misinformation, sowing division and distrust in democratic institutions and undermining the very notion that shared knowledge can exist. So last, but certainly not least, conspiracy theory thrives during periods of broad cultural and political change. Historian Richard Hofstadter says that conspiracy theory is a particular way of understanding change over time. It's a way of looking at the world and its historical events, and it sees conspiracy theory as the motor of history. And that way, somebody who participates in the conspiracy theory gets to become an actor rather than just a passive victim. So in some ways, conspiracy theory can be thought of as a therapeutic response to personal and social contexts of tension and crises. When adherents feel the cultural or social change isn't working out well for them, it's not because of a personal failing, but again, because of that nearly all-powerful organization that's working covertly to undermine them. So as we look at the dynamics of Great Replacement, it maybe makes sense to note that demographics really are changing. We're just getting wonderfully more and more diverse. But recent survey data reveals that in the United States and in Europe, the perception of a growing minority group is often associated with growing prejudice, fear, and anger, especially toward Muslim, Hispanic, and Black communities. And those fear-based reactions are especially common in reaction to just a symbolic threat, including fear about the decline of cultural and civilizational values and norms and identities. conspiracy theories about replacement and about white genocide, they offer narratives to usually white men to process their fear about their own declining status. Of course, threats to cultural values and the status of white men, it's all very nebulous, and it would be actually impossible to measure that kind of a phenomenon. So what's important here is that these are perceived changes, and because they're so nebulous, they're deeply prone to manipulation. And as we'll discuss in future sessions, Great Replacement theory specifically leverages anxieties like these, and then acts them out in relation to the need to control people of color and immigrants and women. Sometimes the need to control them to the point of murder. So there is clearly much, much more to be said about Great Replacement, but hopefully today I've shared enough background information to help you move around the current political world with just a little bit more agility. My hope is that you have a better sense of what Great Replacement is when you hear it, why it can be so dangerous, and what makes it a conspiracy theory. Just to recap, I've given you Great Replacement through the lens of historians, psychologists, and social scientists. And we haven't yet discussed Great Replacement through the lens of religious studies or theology, and that will come in the sessions ahead, I promise. And I'm hoping what also comes up in the sessions ahead is a chance for us to reflect a little bit more on what a faithful response to Great Replacement looks like. How does God call us to show up? What does God ask us to proclaim in public? And how can we flip Great Replacement on its head and commit to the work of truth and trust and justice? And maybe these questions will be percolating for you in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, I'm looking forward to a little bit of reflective conversation with you all. Here, just for your reference, are some of the books that I've talked about in this presentation. Just let me know if you have questions about any of them. I'm happy to pass along information on that. And of course, questions are welcome, but also I have a couple of questions for you in case that's a helpful way to start discussion. First is the one from earlier in the session, just how do you know when the news and the information you receive is the truth? And then this other one is, where do you see diluted forms of Great Replacement theory in public life? So maybe not in its fullest expression, but bits and pieces of it, whether it's social media, the news, among friends, you name it. So it looks like my dad is right there ready to take facilitate.
I said that Aaron was the smartest person I know, and then I realized and remembered that my son Steven is actually on the call. So he's the smartest person. Actually. Aaron, thank you. I think this is going to spark some conversation here in the room, just kind of a technology check between Bob and Marco. If we open it up to conversation, will Aaron be able to hear things in the room from the microphones?
Yes, yes.
Cool. Very cool. Okay. If I swing this around, I don't know, Aaron, if you can actually see the room. You don't have can you see all these lovely people?
There is something.
Oh, there is. Okay. That one is there. Oh, excellent.
Should I stop sharing? Would that be easier for
Yeah, I was just about to say, go ahead, stop sharing.
Okay.
There you go.
Cool. Then we get, then a whole bunch of rectangles start to appear. Well, Aaron is serious, and I think for us to pop or surface some questions or comments about all of this is part of the work of faith. It's part of the work of being the church. So what has been bubbling, and the questions that she posed or things that occurred to you? Can I see Rick is over on the far table?
Yeah, I just had a question for Erin, and it's before we get into the questions that she had. She was talking about cognitive biases, and could she say a little bit more about backfire effect?
Yeah, you're actually making me want to go over and grab my big stack of books because that's where I got that little factoid. But it's my understanding that backfire effect is usually in operation when we're talking about cultural values, political values, religious values, beliefs that are really, really deeply held. And then when we face cognitive dissonance, when we're faced with a challenge that might undermine those really, really core beliefs, the response is actually not just to stick with your original position, but it's actually to go even further in the opposite direction. And I think that's a relatively recently described phenomenon. I think it's especially been considered in light of what we might talk about as just political polarization these days. But yeah, like I said, I would be absolutely happy. I can go find that book and tell you what the book is.
No, that's great.
Sure.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
I see Kurt's hand.
Yeah, from my study of American history, this replacement type theory is permeates throughout American history. I know that the Know Nothing Party, back in the early 1800s, where they were thinking that the Catholics were coming in there, they had a dual alliances. They were really aligned with the Pope and not with true American values, and that kind of thing is sort of throughout. It even happened. The latest that was a real concern during the election of 1960 with John F. Kennedy, and that they were going to replace us with something. And I think that's that's kind of, I think it's all gets new clothing as it moves along in the American theory. There also was a parochial schools were they wanted public schools and they didn't want parochial schools because parochial schools were going to indoctrinate them in non-American ideas. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I agree that the new replacement theory is sounding really prevalent and powerful right now, but I think it's something that we have to realize that it's sort of part of our holistic society, that because we have waves of immigration into this country, we have waves of people coming in, and every new person or new people that come,
It's an old story.
yeah.
Aaron?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kurt. I think I got everything that you said. A couple words were difficult to hear, but I appreciate the way that you described it as a part of the American story. I learned just the other day that the great American classic, The Great Gatsby, actually has Great Replacement in it. That I think it's Daisy's husband who is a believer. And he's not necessarily specifically talking about the same immigrants that we're talking about today. Like you said, they were concerned about other vaguely European immigrants. And the other thing about your comment that I think is really helpful, and we'll get to dig in more in later sessions, is the construction of what we call whiteness. Whiteness has not always been a stable category, right? It hasn't always been obvious the way that we sometimes think it is today. And part of it has to do with religion. And I think that's still a factor in the contemporary Great Replacement theory, is that whiteness is biological, but it's also has to do with political nationality and with ideology and religion. So yeah, I appreciate that, and I hope that you get a chance to notice how we're going to talk about that again. I think week 3 of this session. So thanks.
We've heard from a couple of people in the room. We've got a screen full of little rectangles too, so I don't want to leave out anybody participating online. If there is somebody, wave or turn your camera on or do a chat or something, but let us know because we want to include everyone. Well, I want to give Jim, just give me a chance. I want to stare for a second. I did hear.
Jim and Jan have a hand up.
Oh, Jan, I can't, okay. So can we open the gate for, who did you say, Jan?
Jim and Jan.
Oh, Jim and Jim, okay.
Yeah, just unmute yourself.
We need to unmute.
I don't have, is it that square down there?
Yeah.
Well, we'll give them a chance. Maybe they're trying and we'll get in there. So, Jim Harvey, let's go to you.
That has.
I think that we need to study history. And it's gone on, this whole problem has gone on since man evolved, and it's nothing new. And it's greed, it's desire for power, for sex, for money, for anything that's like that. And you start with motivating with mob action. That's the ultimate thing, you get that. But you do it by telling half truths and repeating it, and repeating it. And people soon start believing. You look at in Africa today, they're having the same problems we're having here, a little bit different political and social structure, but it's the same thing. South America has it. And you don't know much about Asia, but I imagine it's there. I imagine it's worldwide. This is a problem that mankind has faced forever. And we really don't learn. We need to study our history. You try to understand it, but the answer is we as Lutherans need to communicate with the Catholics, with the Baptists, with the other different groups, and get to know each other and learn to trust.
And I think that one of the gifts of sort of a Lutheran approach too is that I heard somebody call Lutherans are pretty good at anthropology. You have a sort of this gritty sense that we really are capable of beautiful things. And well, we are as monstrous as anybody else. Yeah. Well, Aaron, maybe you want to come back to that.
I appreciate, thank you for theologizing that a little bit. Yeah, no, I think, Jim, you're certainly on to something there, that there is something perhaps in human nature that is just driven toward some degree of sinfulness. And then also at the same time, I just want to reiterate, I think the importance of us identifying the most harmful ways that we in our context participate in systems that oppress others, and not to say that nobody else has ever been sinful, but I am interested in looking specifically at the ways that me and my culture, and here I'm talking really, really broadly about culture in the United States and what whiteness means in the United States and how racism functions in the United States. Those are the problems that I'm a part of, and those are the problems, therefore, that I want to try to fix. And so, yes, the problem is large, and also it's very specific. So thank you for bringing that up.
We've got 4 or 5 minutes left, and one thing as you were speaking, Aaron, that occurred to me is that there are strands that are echoing or paralleling or just ring in such a way that the Christian church, my faith, my religion, my practice of the Christian faith, yeah, we have a narrative through which we see stuff. And we have a vocabulary and we have a gospel, we have a biblical text, we have our hymns, we have the Apostles' Creed, and we tend to use those as the telescope through which we look at the universe. And so how do you tell the difference between what is being church and what is being a conspiracy theorist? I'll put you on the spot a little.
No, I love that question. I actually took a whole course just specifically on conspiracy theory and what might be described as like a post-truth era that we're all living in right now. And that kept being one of my questions. I was the only theology student in the class, and I kept going, well, okay, but if we're defining conspiracy theory this way, how does faith enter into that mixture, or does it not? I think it's a great question, but I think the important thing again here to remember is not just that conspiracy theory is not just believing something that a scientist would say is not true. It's not just believing something that most people in a society say is fringe, right? It's a belief that the world is actually controlled by a secret organization of people working together to bring about the apocalypse. And so there may be some expressions of Christian theology that do look a little bit like that. And you do get some overlap, especially, like I said, there are a lot of conspiracy theories with a lot of religious imagery. Like Mark of the Beast conspiracy theories is one of those where people are looking for, which technology might be the mark of the beast and therefore be heralding in, the eschaton and the coming of Jesus. And so there is a little bit of overlap there. But I think it's important to remember that conspiracy theory is it's looking for the bad guys, and it's looking for the bad guys to try to explain why my life isn't working out just right.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, there was a movement of people within the Presbyterian Church to see a more feminine image of God, and the uproar that occurred because the masculine image of God is what we had lived with for so long, and it was like they were going to take over and take away his masculinity, his power, his anger, and so on. Interesting. 1970s.
We like the Presbyterians. Did I see Chris Holby?
Yeah, I guess, Aaron, I hope that you'll discuss at some point the media and its effects on people's minds and what they can do. For example, I watch Channel 5 every day because they tell me they tell the truth. So, how would it please us?
Well, this has really been great. I'm thankful to everybody. Sure, thankful to Aaron. We got 3 sessions to go over the course of these next weeks, and Rick left the room. I was going to give him a chance to do a 1-minute commercial on his class, which Beth, help me out. What's the first day of that one? Do you remember the date?
We're not sometime in November, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find this for you.
Well.
I think it's November 6th.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Rick, whatever he heard, he got mad and left. So, but I think, he's dealing with kind of helping us likewise look in the mirror and taking seriously the reality that so much of the Western church's identity and practice has been shaped not just by scripture, but by what? Colonialism. And how that has shaped so many things in our life together. And how do you untangle some of this stuff and be faithful? Well, Aaron, thank you. I would buy a lunch, but I can't get to New Jersey.
You can send me an Uber Eats or something. Thank you, everyone.
Well, we're getting ready for dinner. I'll offer prayers, and who knows, there might be a little coffee left. The Lord be with you. God, thank you. Thank you for voices and for the truth. Deepen the well in us of curiosity and hope and a willingness to love and engage the other. That the church could be a place, the last place, the best place to exchange, to discover, to grow, to challenge, to witness, to understand what's real and what is true. We pray this and give thanks in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thanks, gang. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Marco. Yay, Marco.
Thank you.